Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to bring you the ultimate horror reading guide. This video is going to contain recommendations for 15 unique subgenres. I'm going to give a quick description of each, along with two recommendations, one that is more classic or popular, along with a recommendation for something that's perhaps a little bit more underhyped or diverse. And I'm really hoping that this video will be a great resource for you all. If you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing if you want more horror bookish content from me. Otherwise, let's get started. First, let's talk about one of my favorite subgenres, and that is possession and exorcism stories. In these, a person, typically a young woman, is possessed by a demon, and often a religious figure, typically a Catholic priest, is called in to exorcise that demon. I like these stories because they tend to have a bit of a psychological aspect, the question of whether or not someone is just mentally unstable or ill, or if something deeper is going on. And I just personally find it very scary and exciting to read. The obvious classic recommendation is, of course, The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty, which is the story of a Hollywood actress whose daughter plays with a Ouija board and then possibly gets possessed. She first goes to all the medical professionals to try to get her daughter help, but when all of them fail her, she turns to the Catholic Church and they bring in a priest to perform an exorcism. It is just as good as the movie, if not better, honestly. And I think it is just such a great and classic place to start with the subgenre because it really follows all of the tropes. It's so well done, it's terrifying, and has some really iconic scenes, not for the faint of heart, so highly recommend. And if you've already read that one, my second recommendation is for Goddess of Filth by V. Castro. This is actually a novella, and it follows a group of Mexican-American young women who go and play with a seance, and during that seance something terrible happens and one of the women appears to become possessed. She starts to bleed and speak in tongues, and the story follows what happens afterwards. They worry about their friend and go to seek her help, and this one probably sounds very similar to the classic story, but it does twist some of those tropes on their head. And I just love this one because it's really fiercely feminist and really takes the narrative back as a female author. I thought that this was really well done and would definitely recommend it. Next, we have Haunted House Stories, which, while it's not a personal favorite of mine, definitely had to be on this list. This is a case where there is some kind of presence or ghost that is haunting a house, and these stories typically go in two different directions. Either it follows a family that is moving into a house that seems too good to be true, it's cheap and accessible, and there's always a catch. Or in the case of the recommendations I'm going to give here, it follows a group of experts that are going in to investigate a house that is already known or believed to be haunted. The classic example I want to give is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. This follows a group of both believers and skeptics who go into the Hill House, and they spend several nights there investigating what is going on and trying to figure out what is happening. I describe this as very cozy horror. It's very classic and easy to follow and very accessible for its age. The other book I want to recommend, if you've already read the classic, is 12 Nights at Rotherhouse by J.W. Ocker. This follows a young writer who wants to start their career and write a story all about living in a haunted house, so they agree to spend 13 nights in this house and then write about it. However, you find out right from the beginning that this journalist is not a believer. They are a big skeptic, and so they don't actually think anything's going to happen. But of course, it's a horror story, so things possibly do. But in order to write their story, they try to recreate the haunted house experience. So it goes through the haunted house tropes where their cell phone dies, they play with a Ouija board, and all of these things that you should not do in a haunted house. And the story plays out from there. It's very unexpected with some good twists and turns, and I think this one is just a lot of fun once you've read a lot of haunted house stories and are looking for something that kind of plays around with the genre and kind of makes fun of itself. Next up, I want to talk about vampire stories, which probably don't need a lot of introduction. You're familiar with the blood-sucking creatures. These stories tend to have a sexual aspect to them and can be very gothic and haunting. And so, of course, the classic I need to mention is Dracula by Bram Stoker, which is a very accessible classic, and I thought it was very easy to read. A lot of the stories told in epistolary form, so through letters, and it's not the most feminist story. It definitely has its age, but it really does hold up for a classic and gives you a really good grounding in vampire stories. It's not technically the first piece of vampire fiction written, but it's definitely one that popularized the genre and really is worth your time. If you're looking for something more diverse and modern, I would recommend Certain Dark Things by Silvia Moreno Garcia. And this is a take on vampire stories that is set in Mexico, in a world where vampires are no longer in hiding, but the world knows that they exist and they live among the population. And this story is very interesting because it pulls from different mythology, including Aztec mythology. And I just thought the world building and the reasoning behind the vampires was really interesting. It's very slow moving and very heavy on character development, so if that's something you enjoy, you might really want to check this one out. Next, I want to talk about zombies, which is admittedly a rather controversial subgenre. Not everyone loves them. Not everyone is a fan of the idea of these creatures that resurrect and walk around as the living dead with rotting flesh, feeding on living humans. But I like these stories because often they are not really about the zombies, but so much more about people and how they survive, and either how they come together as a community or tear each other apart. And so it's just a really interesting take on apocalyptic fiction, in my opinion, where technology tends to break down. The modern classic I want to recommend is actually a graphic novel, and that is The Walking Dead by Robert Kirkman. Yes, the graphic novel that popularized the TV show, and it really does hold up. The first volume starts the story just like it does in the TV show, which of course was based off of the graphic novel. And it follows a group of survivors in a zombie apocalypse. It's a very traditional zombie story, and it really follows the tropes of having a group of people come together, but there are betrayals, there are evil men that survive to the end of the world, and you get to see those character dynamics, those relationships play out. And I just think it's a very addictive story. It's very well done. And again, if you want just a very classic tropey zombie narrative done in a very interesting and addicting way, I think this is an excellent place to start. If you want something a little bit different, I would turn you to Dread Nation by Justina Ireland. And this is set right after the American Civil War, which ended differently because right at the end there was a zombie outbreak. And so people had to turn from fighting each other to fighting the zombies. The story follows a young Black woman who has been trained how to fight zombies and now uses her training to protect young white women. The story, of course, not only deals with zombies, but also a lot of important racial and class issues. And I just thought it was very well done. And I would say that the first one is technically classified as young adult horror, but certainly appeals to all ages. And I recommend that even if you don't love the first book, continue on to the second book, Deathless Divide. The second book is so well done. It reads very much like adult, and the character work is amazing. One of my favorites, highly recommend. Next up, we need to talk about Gothic Horror, which admittedly is not to my personal taste, but definitely deserves attention on this list. And these stories tend to read very classically. They have a heavy emphasis on romanticism and emotions. And so the very classic example is something like Turn of the Screw by Henry James, which is a very iconic ghost story and one that I did not personally enjoy, but if you enjoy Gothic fiction, that is a very accessible place to start into Gothic horror. Something more modern that is more to my taste is something like Mexican Gothic, also by Silvia Moreno Garcia. You're going to see a few authors show up a few times on this list. And this follows a young woman who is a socialite in historical Mexico. She gets a letter from her cousin who is recently married, and things just seem to be not quite right. So she goes off to investigate what has happened to her cousin. She goes off and meets her cousin's in-laws, and things are very strange. There's just something going on around the house. It follows a lot of the tropes and classic atmosphere of Gothic fiction, but it does go in a much more modern direction. So you do need to be prepared for that it really does a modern take on that subgenre, which is personally why I liked it, but you need to be prepared. If you are a Gothic truist, this one might kind of raise your eyebrows, so I'll leave it there, but it is obviously one that I personally love. Next, I want to talk about apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic fiction, essentially books about the end of the world, usually involving some kind of virus or world-ending event, whether it be environmental or otherwise. And for a classic example, I want to recommend I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. This follows a man who believes himself to be the last man alive on Earth. Everyone else has been turned into zombie-like vampires, and so he is left on his own trying to survive. He is a huge skeptic and uses his scientific background to experiment on these creatures and try to find a more realistic explanation other than the fact that zombies and vampires have broken out. And this is a very iconic story and really does hold up. I thought the story was very haunting. He is a very memorable character, and I think it's a very interesting take on the apocalypse, because a lot of the classic stories that I could have recommended involve a group of people, but this one instead is very much a lonely story about one person. It's very dark and depressing in tone, but somehow I still really loved it and do recommend it. It has a fantastic ending, which you don't always get to say about a lot of horror books. The other book I want to recommend for a more modern apocalyptic story is The Girl in Red by Christina Henry, and this follows a young woman who is surviving on her own, trying to get to her grandmother's house after a virus has broken out and possibly killed off a lot of people, including her family. This, given the title, you might know, is a retelling of Little Red Riding Hood, but other than the basic inspiration, it really doesn't have a lot to do with that. Instead, it really reads like apocalyptic fiction, where it's all about survival. The main character is a very strong young woman, and it was just a really solid story that was easy to follow, easy to get into, and a lot more underhyped than a lot of the bigger names that you get thrown around when you talk about this very iconic subgenre. Next, I want to talk about dystopian horror, which is not a subgenre that gets a lot of attention, and some people might argue with me whether or not it is, but essentially, as opposed to apocalyptic fiction, this is horror that comes or draws from the horrors of an overriding government that takes control and leads to horrible, horrible events. The classic example I want to give is The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, which follows a oppressive government that has come into place when infertility has run rampant, and so certain women who are fertile are no longer considered to be people but property, and their only purpose is to help people have children by bearing them and then passing them along to the proper adults. And this story, while yes, is typically classified as literary fiction or speculative fiction, the more I read Atwood, the more I consider her to be a horror author, and I really think that this one holds up among the best. Definitely worth your time. It is an iconic story and a memorable one at that. Now, for something more modern, I would also recommend Tender is the Flesh, which is set in a dystopian future where animal meat has become unsafe for consumption, and so the governments have allowed the production of what they call special meat, which you find out is actually the consumption of human meat, so humans are being bred in captivity and treated like animals. The story follows a man who works as a butcher in one of these factories, and right at the beginning of the story, he gets a live specimen, a human woman, and he has to take care of her, and the story goes from there. This book is highly dark, highly disturbing, very gruesome, not for everyone, but if you can stand it, it is a very smart and insightful story that has a lot of commentary on so many important topics, and is definitely a great example of dystopian horror, which I think is a genre we're going to see more and more of as the years go on. Next up, I want to talk about cosmic horror, which is a genre that I'll admit is not a personal favorite of mine, and it's rather hard to define. Essentially, it's about the unknowable on a cosmic scale, and it's kind of one that you know it when you see it. If you're going to talk classic examples, you do unfortunately have to go back to Lovecraft. A lot of his short stories really did define the genre, and of course, you could check out something like The Call of Cthulhu. I personally recommend going to more modern examples of cosmic horror, and the one I want to recommend is The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor LaValle, which is a retelling of one of Lovecraft's stories in a modern lens from the perspective of a black man, and so it gives an own voices commentary and really is a reaction to the fact that all of these amazing stories came from someone who was very publicly known as a racist person. So I think it's a very good place to go if you feel uncomfortable with the roots of this subgenre, subgenre, but like it in terms of its execution and what it does in terms of its storytelling. So those are some places that you can go. Next, I want to talk about creature horror, which is very popular on screen and certainly also has its roots in fiction. And so just like it sounds, essentially it's a horror story that involves some sort of creature. And for this category, I'm excluding things like zombies and vampires because they typically get their own subgenres. But a classic example I want to recommend is Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton, which of course is about a group of people that resurrect dinosaurs and put them in a park for entertainment, and things go horribly wrong. I know a lot of people would define this book as a thriller, but I would better recommend it or suggest that it is actually horror. The movie is, yes, much more of a thriller, but the book certainly has more roots in horror. It is very gruesome and dark in its execution, and so I think it fits the category perfectly. Now, you probably already read that one, so the other one I want to recommend is Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant, and this follows a group who go on an expedition to the Marianas Trench to find out what happened to a previous expedition that went out to film a mockumentary about mermaids. Things went terribly wrong, and well, mermaids possibly exist, and so the crew is going out to find out what happened. This is a fantastic story, one of my personal favorites, so I recommend it constantly. But if you love good character work with diverse characters and you just love a story that is both gruesome and smart and has a lot of elements of science fiction, just like in Jurassic Park, this is an excellent place to go and just a lot of fun. Next, I want to talk about folk horror, which has a few definitions, but essentially I describe it as horror that takes place in some kind of small town where there are some very long-running traditions with some horrible, horrific roots. And so the classic example I would give is actually a short story, and that is The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. A lot of us had to read it in school, but it follows a small town that has this yearly lottery, and you get to find out that there are some horrific events that come out for whoever is selected and wins this lottery. A more modern example I want to give is Hex by Thomas Oldhovelt, and this is set in a town where there is a witch that wanders the town, and the people of this town need to keep the identity of this witch quiet. They do not want people to know that she is there, and so they have the town on a bit of a lockdown, and the teenagers do not like this because they have very little access to social media. They have to keep everything very quiet, and they don't really want to listen to this, and so the teenagers make some poor choices and decide to expose more than they should, and terrible things ensue, and it's really a story about the terrible things that people do to each other. And I think it's a really good example of a modern take on folk horror, which is a really good counterbalance to a lot more of the classic stories you will find if you start looking deeper into this subgenre. Next, I want to talk about survival horror, which is exactly what it sounds like, a group of people needing to survive a horrific event. Often these involve a group of people that have some sort of family or friend connection, and through the process of trying to survive, it starts to break down their relationships as they turn on each other. There's also typically a lack of resources, which adds to the tension and stress of the group. A very classic example of this, or at least a modern classic, is The Terror by Dan Simmons, which is a very large and iconic book all about a historical expedition that went out to the cold waters of the north, and they got stuck over several winters, and so it follows them as their resources are dwindling and there is possibly something outside that is coming for them. And it's just, again, very epic in scale and very grand, and I think it really plays into the idea of a lack of resources. They talk about having, their dwindling supplies and running out of alcohol, which is very concerning on a crew like this. And so if you haven't read it, if you're up for the task, because it is, again, a bigger book, it is one that really does capture the survival genre really well. Another book I want to recommend is The Troop by Nick Cutter, and this follows a group of Boy Scouts that are out camping in the Prince Edward Island of Canada, and they come across this man who is voraciously hungry. They try to help him out, and things go terribly wrong, and soon enough the boys turn on each other in order to survive. This book is often described as the horror version of Lord of the Flies, and that definitely holds up. You have some young people doing terrible things. They are awful to each other. And I do need to give warnings that this book is very gruesome and has a lot of body horror, so you do need to be okay with that. But it is a very good example of survival horror and, in my opinion, a lot of fun. Also, content warnings for harm to animals. Next, I want to talk about science fiction horror, which is a rather classic subgenre or crossover between two genres that have a lot in common. And so these are typically horror books that lean heavily into the elements of science and technology in order to progress the story. And there's actually a lot of books I could recommend. It's a very large subgenre with a lot of different avenues you can go down. The very classic example, of course, I need to mention is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which is more so literary fiction, and a lot of people would argue it leans more towards science fiction if you go back to the actual story rather than the adaptations. But it is very much the early roots of these genres, and so it is one that you might want to check out if you like to read through the classics. I more prefer a more modern take on sci-fi horror, and so the one I want to recommend is rather underhyped, but one of my favorites, and that is Ship of Fools by Richard Paul Russo. And this is a piece of space horror, which is something people ask me to recommend all the time. It follows a group of people living on this generational ship, and they have lost their direction, lost their mission or purpose for why they are out there. They come across a ship that is possibly alien, and they go in to investigate. And well, let's just say it might be haunted, there might be more going on, and the story really goes from there. If you are a fan of sci-fi horror in video games or in movies, this one is going to be right up your alley. It was so fun, so well done, and obviously one I highly recommend. Next, I want to talk about psychological horror, which essentially is horror that plays with the mental state of the characters within the book, and if it's done properly, also with the mental state of the reader. A really classic example of this is the iconic book House of Leaves by Mark Z. Densolewski, and this is a book that I think everyone knows quite well because of the way that it is printed and designed. It's a story about a story within story. It's about a house where the inside and the outside measurements don't match, and the story gets very weird. It's a book that you are turning the pages, turning the orientation of the book as you're reading, and it gets weirder and weirder as you go along. If you can stay immersed in this story, I know for a lot of people it can be one of the most terrifying books they've ever read because it really does play with them on a psychological level. So it's definitely one to try out and see if it works for you. Another example of psychological horror that personally worked better for me was actually a manga, and that is Uzumaki by Junji Ito. And this one is set in a town where everyone starts to see spirals, and they just become obsessed with them, and you start to see spirals in snail shells, and just everything around them looks like a spiral, and the story gets scarier and scarier. The premise is hard to pitch because it doesn't sound scary, but trust me, it is. And Junji Ito, in my opinion, is the master of psychological horror. The pictures, the atmosphere, everything comes together, and I got completely immersed and sucked into the story. Easily one of the scariest books that I've ever read. Then I want to talk about the subgenre of creepy children, for lack of a better term. And these are stories that involve children that are assumed to be very creepy in nature. And this horror subgenre is really fun because it plays with the fact that children are supposed to be sweet and innocent, and so like most good horror stories do, they turn that on its head. A classic example is something like We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, which follows a family that is believed to be behind some nefarious events, and the rest of the town is very suspicious and wary of them. And for its age, I gotta say, it's a pretty twisted story. A more modern example I want to recommend is Sour Candy by Keelan Patrick Burke, which is actually a horror novella following a man who sees a child having a tantrum in a grocery store, and at first is very thankful for the fact that he purposely chose to stay childless himself. However, this child follows him home and somehow becomes his own child, and he just can't get rid of him. This child is very creepy, obsessed with sour candy, and becomes the man's worst nightmare. This is a book I always recommend to those that have purposely decided not to have children, because I really think it will validate your life choices if you have ever had them come into doubt. And it's a lot of fun, it's a quick read, and again, a very modern classic of the genre that follows those tropes and just it shows you how absolutely creepy children can be. And last but certainly not least, I want to talk about the subgenre of supernatural horror, which is actually a pretty large one encompassing a lot of the other books I've mentioned before. But two books that fit within this topic are ones that I wanted to include in this video because I do recommend them to new and seasoned readers alike if you haven't. Essentially, it's just like it sounds. Supernatural horror involves some kind of supernatural or fantastical element in order for the story to occur or happen, and so typically horror does lean into the paranormal, and so unsurprisingly I'm going to start by recommending a very popular one that is a favorite as well, and that is Nosferatu by Joe Hill. And this follows a young girl who has supernatural abilities where she can find objects that have gone missing, and so because of that she ends up getting pulled into finding missing children that have stolen away by a man named Charlie Manx, who takes them in his Rolls Royce to a place called Christmasland. And the story is epic in scale, set around Christmas, and really following this epic showdown between this woman, Vic, and this evil man, Charlie Manx. It is so iconic, so fun, and again, I think it's a story that I want to recommend for this subgenre because you really do have to buy into these fantastical elements and believe in the girl's paranormal abilities in order to go along with the story, but if you can buy in, it is so much fun and well worth your time. Another one I want to recommend is The Changeling by Victor LaValle, and this follows a black man named Apollo who at the beginning of the story has a wife and child, but something terrible happens and his family is torn apart, and he has to go on a mission or journey in order to try to save his family, and the story goes from there. It follows almost a fairy tale narrative and definitely has some fantastical elements that come to the story. I'm reluctant to say what they are, but the story definitely leans into horror fantasy, and I think those elements just really enhance the story. So if you're up for a story that is going to really pull on your suspension of disbelief, but in a really good way, it reads like urban fantasy, but it's really horror, and it's so well done, and of course has some fantastic social commentary in it. Overall, just a really good story and a beautiful story about fatherhood. So one of my personal favorites, had to include in this video, obviously recommend. So that is it for this video. I would love to hear down below if you found this video to be helpful. What is your favorite subgenre and what are recommendations of your favorite books in those categories? If you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of horror, and if you want more videos like this, I've actually done separate videos on several of these subgenres, so I'm going to link a playlist down below and in the cards so you can go and check that out. If you thought this video was helpful, you can also give it a thumbs up and share it around online on places like Twitter and Reddit. And if you're already subscribed, thank you so much. You can still hit that notification bell so that you never miss a video from me. Thank you so much for watching. I will talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.